Richard Monroe had it all. The money, the power, the influence. At 56, he was the CEO of Monroe Capital, a global empire that controlled billions of dollars. He spent his days in marble boardrooms, flying in private jets, and attending lavish events with some of the world's wealthiest. But inside, Richard was hollow. His mansion was a vast, silent tomb. And no amount of money could fill the emptiness that followed the death of the woman he once loved. That morning, as he stared out the window of his penthouse office, the weight of everything he had built felt like a suffocating cloud. His world had come crashing down with scandal. One of his top executives caught on tape making vile, racist comments. The media was in a frenzy. Investors were panicking. His company's reputation was on the line. But then, his assistant Claire presented him with a solution. A quick PR fix. A visit to River Park Children's Center, a rundown shelter for abandoned kids. It would be an easy photo op, a charitable donation, a quick way to save face. Richard wasn't expecting anything more than a few images to quiet the noise. But then he saw them, the 4 children no one else wanted. They weren't dressed up for the cameras. They weren't smiling for the world to see. They sat alone in a room, their eyes guarded, their hope long extinguished. Ashley, the oldest, stood with her arms crossed, her expression hard as stone. Jaden, the angry young boy, barely looked up. Livia, the quiet artist, was scribbling on a sheet of paper, as if the world didn't exist around her. Kamari, the toddler, clung to his blanket like it was his only lifeline. It was then that Richard felt something shift deep inside him. For the first time in years, his heart was pounding. But why? What if these children weren't just a part of his company's public relations stunt? What if they were the missing piece of his own broken life? Richard Monroe, billionaire, power broker, and master of control, found himself standing at a crossroads. What was more important? The empire he had spent his life building, or a chance to give these kids the family they had been denied? What would it take to prove to them that they were more than a charity case? That they were worth more than a quick headline? This wasn't just another PR move. This was about to become his own redemption. And everything he thought he knew about himself was about to change forever. Don't miss this story. Hit subscribe now and stay with us until the end. The journey of a billionaire who realized that family isn't built on power. It's built on love. This is the story of transformation. The next morning, Richard Monroe stood in his office, staring at the check his assistant Claire had handed him. He could feel the weight of it. A 6-figure donation meant to ease the backlash from his company's latest scandal. It was supposed to fix everything, to silence the press, and to allow his company to continue growing unaffected. But as he stared at the number, something gnawed at him. The donation felt hollow, like a band-aid on a wound that had already been exposed. The media frenzy around his senior partner's racist outburst had brought everything to the surface. The carefully curated image of the man who controlled everything, from the markets to his own life, was suddenly fragile. Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. "Sir, there's something else we need to address. The River Park Children's Center. They could use the donation as well, but more importantly, they could use a public gesture. Something to show you're genuinely committed to diversity and philanthropy." Richard knew what she meant. Visit. Quick photo op. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at the tablet Claire handed him. She had already compiled a list of potential actions, donations, statements, and the kind of diversity initiatives that would ease the tension and distract from the scandal. But Richard was tired of optics, tired of playing the game. He wanted something real. His gut twisted at the thought. "Fine. Let's do it," Richard muttered, flipping through the pages of the report. But in the back of his mind, he knew that this was more than just a PR move. Something was pulling at him, something deeper than the need to fix the company's image. The next day, Richard's black Bentley rolled slowly to a stop outside the River Park Children's Center. It was a far cry from the gleaming buildings he was used to, the manicured lawns and high-tech glass facades. The shelter was a dilapidated, crumbling building, far removed from the polished world Richard had come to dominate. The rusted metal fence sagged, The windows cracked, and the walls were weathered from years of neglect. But the mural painted on the side of the building, a faded picture of children holding hands, was still visible. It was a sad, desperate symbol of a world forgotten. As Richard stepped out of the car, he was greeted by the director of the center, a woman in her 60s who seemed as worn down as the building itself. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Thank you for coming." Richard nodded briefly, glancing at the interior. The air inside smelled like disinfectant and wet carpet, an overwhelming reminder of how far these kids had fallen in the system. It wasn't what he was expecting, but he kept his face neutral, his demeanor one of calm detachment. As they walked through the facility, the children in the rooms glanced up at him. Curious, polite, but distant, too used to disappointment to expect anything else. Then they arrived at the common area, where the youngest children were gathered, eager for the photo op that Richard had been told to expect. Smiles were coaxed out, a check was handed over, and the staff cheered. It was going exactly as planned, until Richard noticed them. In a small room off to the side sat 4 children, all of them together, huddled in the corner, and entirely different from the others. No smiles, no balloons, no treats, just silence. There was Ashley, the oldest. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes sharp and protective. Jaden, the boy who looked like he was trying to shrink into the chair, angry and stiff, staring straight ahead. Livia, barely 10, was drawing quietly on the floor with broken crayons, her brow furrowed in concentration. And then there was Kamari, the youngest, clinging to a tattered blanket, thumb stuck in his mouth as if the world was too much for him. Richard could feel the tension rising. There was something different about these children. They weren't pretending, weren't playing the part. They didn't care about his money, his influence. They had seen enough to know it wouldn't save them. As the director spoke, Richard learned that the children were siblings. For kids that no one wanted. It wasn't just that they were overlooked, it was that no one would take them because they came together and they were too much. Too much for the families who wanted just one child. Too much for the families who wanted a child that looked like them. Richard heard the words, but his mind was elsewhere. He was staring at Livia's drawing, a simple picture of a house with 4 stick figures. The larger figure stood beside them, but there was no face. No face. Richard felt a strange heaviness in his chest. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred. The cold, controlled man who had built an empire on perfect calculations suddenly felt unsure. What if this wasn't just about a donation? What if this wasn't just about optics? What if this was about him? That night, as he sat alone in his study, Richard stared at the picture Livia had left behind. The house, the 4 children, and the faceless figure. Something in him cracked. A figure. What if it was supposed to be him? The next morning, without a word to anyone, Richard stood at the edge of his bed, still in the clothes he had worn the night before. He hadn't slept. The image of the drawing lingered, and something deep inside him told him he had to do something more. He walked into his office at 8 a.m., where his team was gathered, already discussing the fallout from the scandal. The usual charts, the usual figures. Richard barely glanced at them. He put the tablet down. "I'm adopting them," Richard said flatly. The room froze. "Sir?" Claire asked, incredulous. "I want the adoption paperwork started." "I'm bringing them home," Richard repeated, his voice firm. There was no hesitation in his words, no calculated strategy. Just a decision, pure and simple. His executives were in a state of shock. "Richard, this isn't advisable," one of them finally stammered. "What about the optics? The PR implications?" Richard's eyes narrowed, his tone cold. "I don't care about optics. I don't care about the PR implications. I care about the fact that no one else wants them. That's reason enough." Claire's eyes flicked nervously toward the door. She had seen Richard make tough decisions, but this was different. Richard turned to her. "Get the paperwork started. Make the calls." By that afternoon, the story broke. The headlines shifted from corporate scandal to Richard Monroe's bold move to adopt the siblings, Ashley, Jaden, Livia, and Kamari. The press wasn't kind. Some hailed him as a hero, others accused him of using the children for a redemption arc. But Richard didn't care. For once, the noise didn't bother him. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. He wasn't doing this for anyone but them. 3 days later, Richard found himself at River Park again. This time no cameras, no reporters, just him. As he signed the adoption papers, the social worker and the shelter director looked on, exchanging glances that betrayed their disbelief. "No one's ever shown interest in them before," the social worker remarked as she glanced at the kids, waiting for them to come downstairs. Richard just nodded. "I'm sure." When the kids appeared, it wasn't the joyful reunion he had imagined. Ashley stood first, her eyes still suspicious. Jaden followed, his head down, a hoodie pulled over his face like a shield. Livia clutched her sketchpad, her eyes avoiding his. Kamari, the youngest, blinked up at him, confused. "You're going to be staying with me now," Richard said, trying to sound warm but unsure of the words. Ashley looked at him for a long moment. "How long?" she asked, her voice flat, but with an edge of something else. Defiance, hope, maybe fear. "As long as you need," Richard replied, his voice steady. Ashley didn't respond. She just turned on her heel and walked out the door, her siblings trailing behind her. The car ride back to the estate was silent. Richard sat in the front with the driver, while the kids sat in the back, too stiff to speak, too cautious to trust. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard could feel the uncertainty in the air. The grandeur of the house, with its marble floors and sweeping staircases, was a far cry from the small, neglected shelter they had just left. The silence in the mansion was suffocating, just as it had always been for him. No laughter, no voices, no warmth. But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't mind the silence. He welcomed it because for the first time, he knew that things were about to change. He didn't know how long it would take or how hard it would be, but one thing was clear. He was going to make sure they knew they were home. As the months went by, Richard Monroe's world shifted in ways he never expected. The mansion that had once felt like a hollow shell now echoed with life. The laughter, the arguments, the chaos of a real family. The kids had begun to settle in, slowly but surely. Ashley, who had once kept her distance, now helped make dinner, making sure everything was perfect for everyone. Jaden, the quiet observer, had started to open up, even helping Richard with some of the company's tech projects. Livia's art now adorned the walls, and Kamari, the fragile one, had stopped waking in the middle of the night, no longer clinging to his blanket for safety. But it wasn't perfect. There were days when the walls of their past still loomed large. Times when Ashley would retreat into herself, or when Kamari would wake with tears in his eyes, remembering the life he'd left behind. Richard, though, was always there. No more board meetings at midnight. No more skipping family dinners for another deal. His schedule had changed, his priorities had shifted. He had walked away from his empire in many ways, but he had never been more present in his life. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Richard watched them all. Ashley, Kamari, Livia, and Jaden. There was a new comfort in their presence, an unspoken understanding that they were finally becoming something real. No longer strangers, no longer burdens. They were becoming his children in every sense of the word. Ashley had called him Dad one night, almost as if she didn't even realize it. Her voice was steady, her tone soft, but there was no hesitation this time. It wasn't just a word, it was a promise. And for Richard, it was the moment he knew his journey wasn't about rebuilding an empire anymore. It was about building a family, one that would stand by him through everything. It wasn't easy. Some people still talked, questioning his motives. Some still believed he was using them for redemption. But Richard didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The only thing that mattered was the family he had created. He found peace in the small moments, the soft whispers as they passed each other in the hallways, the laughter in the living room, the way they all pulled together when life got tough. And though the world outside was full of noise, inside there was love. true, unwavering love that was not born from wealth or power, but from choosing to stay, to show up, to be present every single day. Richard Monroe had spent a lifetime building empires. But in the end, it was the family he chose that gave him something far greater than any fortune ever could. And it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, the children he had saved, and the ones who had saved him right back. As Richard looked out the window, watching the sun set over the garden, he thought about the long journey ahead. There would be struggles, yes, but there would also be moments of joy, of growth, and of hope. And that was worth more than anything he had ever achieved before. If this story touched you, if you believe in the power of love, kindness, and second chances, then make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. What would you do if you were in Richard's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Acts of Kindness Stories for more inspiring journeys like this. We're aiming for 10,000 subscribers, and we need your support to make it happen. Together, let's keep spreading kindness and changing lives, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.